Night has fallen all around us. The moon is high in the air, and the light in the room is a small glow from a single candle between the two of us. We find ourselves lost, or battle-worn, or fallen to a mutual enemy, and I turn to you, and I begin to reveal a part of myself. Possibly because I trust you, possibly because I've never shared this before with anyone, or possibly because this might be our last moment together. And I reveal to you my very personal and my very original tragic backstory. So you see, about a few months ago, I remember watching something with my younger sibling, and during a moment intended to be sad and dreary, they vocalized while looking at their phone that it must be time to hear about this character's big, tragic backstory. A notion that was equal parts funny because what we were watching wasn't that good, and partially insightful because they were exactly right. That movie had been predictable and unoriginal, and when the movie finally took a moment to bring up the emotional turmoil of the character, it was so equal parts formulaic. Which, compounded by several of the video and tips I see within the tabletop community that is something I run in, that are something to the effect of your character's past doesn't have to be miserable, or playing D&D on hard mode is giving your character a cheerful backstory. And I can't help but notice the kind of uptick on each of these drives, which really got me wondering, why is it that the tragic backstory as a narrative device is so popular, but simultaneously started to feel so failing at the same time? So I thought I'd take a moment to ponder and wonder about this narrative device and what it's good for.
I mean, who does Zuko think he is?
Do you really want to know?
General Iroh. We were just...
It's okay.
And I think the first thing that comes to my mind is the reveal, right? This is why we're tired of seeing Batman's parents die and why we're tired of seeing Uncle Ben die. There's nothing illuminating about the event itself anymore, and especially when the event takes 30 minutes of screen time, the whole tragedy feels dry and boring because we know this, which doesn't mean that a new version of the story can't introduce new interesting elements, but this backstory is so ingrained into the myth of these characters that their ability to resonate emotionally off demonstration alone is failing. And the reveal is important. I think the reveal hints at the emotional authenticity of revealing an intimate or secretive part of oneself to another. This is a great way a film, a show, or game can replicate the vulnerability of a character while simultaneously explaining their perspective and attitude throughout the work. That doesn't mean it has to be just a justification of action, but it does mean that it does reveal something or should illuminate something new about the character, especially when they're not the main character of the story. And it's easy to think of, say, Zuko from Avatar: The Last Airbender, when Uncle Iroh reveals to the audience and to the people of Zuko's ship about the origin of his scar. When Zuko was finally allowed into the war council and spoke out of line, his father took it upon himself to punish him in a duel, and look specifically at the language he uses.
You will fight for your honor.
A sentiment that is going to be repeated by Zuko to the point of parody, which is equally parts tragic and also revealing about why Zuko remains a villain to our heroes.
If we knew each other back then, do you think we could have been friends too?
ATLA has been done to death in this department, and I don't think I need to sing its praises too much, but I do think Zuko is a prominent character for the audience to see in this vulnerable, understanding state, while he's still a villain. More so, this is also very specific to Zuko and this world, which is going to lead me to my next point, which, if the backstory needs to be a reveal, this reveal also needs to build to something. This tragic backstory needs to create a sense of tone, emotional weight, or drama within the dimensions of the fiction itself. In some capacity, a tragic backstory is equal parts an exposition dump as well as a character beat. We're not just learning the emotional turmoil of a character, we're generally also learning the lore and factual plot events of what occurred. Which is why genre fiction really loves this. While generally there are emotions afterwards that show emotional reflection, that doesn't change that this moment is another glimpse into quite possibly the crueler or possibly less kind aspects of the world that these characters all inhabit.
So how'd you mess up your arm, huh, Jet?
What does that have to do with it?
Nothing at all.
So when are you gonna answer my question?
When you answer mine.
Let's take Jet Black from the extremely popular sci-fi anime Cowboy Bebop. I choose him because he's not Spike, who also gets talked to death, but because he only gets 2 episodes of emotional backstory when he loses his old romantic partner and his arm. During the course of these 2 episodes, we do factually learn what happens. Jet waited 6 months for his love to return to him before deciding to leave, and his old cop partner set him up in an ambush, and in the following fight, he lost his arm. Now that's factually what happens, and on paper, that's pretty sad. Lost love and physical trauma are pretty easy and written strings to pull on. However, I think what really creates the drama of these moments is how they're delivered and how the dialogue speaks about them. Cowboy Bebop as a whole is a show of lack of purpose and personal failure.
The way you talk about it, you seem to think that time really has stopped here.
You just couldn't play the game like everybody else. But people who go against the Syndicate lose, Jet. They lose big.
The show is about several themes, but I feel these two themes are quite prominent, and thus as an extension of that, so must be the characters. In Jet's tragic backstory and emotional journey must be some form of an articulation of that.
I don't think you'll be waiting very long. Because time never stands still, you know? One bullet? You knew I'd take you out with your gun like this.
I guess I couldn't quit smoking after all.
And that they are. Jet failing to be anything more than a provider for his old partner creates an examination of how limiting your perceptions of people ruins your relationships, which, in tandem with his overzealous commitment to his work, ended in permanent physical harm to his body. And both failures bring him to the point where the audience meets him as the stubborn mom of the Bebop. He's crass with all the members, yet he's also the only one who routinely invites them back, because the stable home of the Bebop is the only purpose that he feels he has.
This is what I paid, yeah, for being too gung-ho and running ahead of the game. You get the point?
I don't want to do this, Jet.
Then why are you?
Both of those episodes are pretty solid, but this, like we've been talking about, does more than reveal Jet's past and does more than just be sad. It explains Jet's past behavior for better and for worse, while also suggesting something new about the central motif of failure and purpose. The story doesn't stop moving forward for him to have his personal moment, but instead furthers the theme as an extension of his character, least of which is showing how the institution of law enforcement is characterized by Bebop Universe as something corrupt and self-gratifying that ultimately leads to failing personal relationships. And maybe this sounds obvious, but, think of Scott Shelby from Heavy Rain. He's a private investigator, investigating and desperately trying to find the Origami Killer. Oh, wait, I'm sorry.
Origami Killer.
Plans of the Origami Killer.
Until the game reveals that he is the Origami Killer through the reveal of his tragic backstory of watching his sibling drown. And for what purpose does this ultimately serve the narrative or themes? None. It doesn't serve anything, and this is a pretty big moment, right? This is the big reveal of a murder mystery. But, let's give it a charitable read for a second. In Heavy Rain, you're Ethan Winters, a father trying to save his son from a killer, so is this game about parenthood? Sure, yeah. I don't know why we bother playing as Madison or Jaden then, so does all the trials Ethan undergoes reflect some lesson about fatherhood or being a paternal figure? Not really. They're all just hypotheticals actualized into set pieces. So is the theme how far you'll go for love? Well, that doesn't quite work either, because what Scott Shelby's dad did is he just kind of didn't care. He wouldn't even have to walk that far. So perhaps this is a little unfair because Heavy Rain doesn't really have a central theme or motif, so it makes an easy example, but I think it shows how shallow this tool of a tragic backstory can be. Even if this was consistent to some capacity, the fact that Scott Shelby is the killer and his obsession with fathers isn't really reflective of that game, but, our metagaming's obsession with fatherhood. It's not like those couldn't be earned, and the idea of playing as the villain is cool, but ultimately it does very little to illuminate anything, so the tragedy ends up flopping and feeling like a Pop Psych 100 class.
Do you have any idea how it feels to be a worthless nothing in your father's eyes? Believe me, I've suffered.
In the last part of this whole tool that I think is worth mentioning, and I talk about this frequently on my podcast, which is going to be my shameless plug to go listen to my podcast, Champion Casters, but the main thing is that with Scott Shelby and a lot of these very shallow and empty tragic backstories, I think there's also just a simple lack of care put into the usage of the material itself. And I mean that in two ways. One is the way we've been talking about, where the reveal and delve into the backstory is sad, but relatively meaningless in the greater context of the story. But there's also another side of it, which is the genuine treatment from the storytellers or writers of the tragedy itself. This can come from the dealing with heavy subject matter like drama, several types of systemic harm, and even worse when a show is going to be performative of whatever topical social issue. But for the sake of levity, let's go with an extremely silly example, like Cruella de Vil from Cruella, whose mom gets killed by a pack of Dalmatians to explain why she hates Dalmatians.
Okay, so, see, the funny thing is that people know this is bad, and it properly laughed at it, which is kind of my point with this whole treat it with care idea. Generally, the audience can sense when it doesn't work, and it feels either laughable or offensive, but for the sake of it, let's break down why this is so bad. Well, for one, this is artificial and borderline absurd, right? Like, tragedy is bad thing that happens, which is connected to future action. Okay, so her mom was killed by dogs, so now she hates dogs. You really can't make this shit up, because loss of a parent could be a real impactful meditation on grief and lack of a caretaker, which can totally be earned. Hell, we've seen it, plenty of characters have this story. But this is not one of those examples, and it's laughably bad because the conflict and tragic event is hyper-specific to absurdity that doesn't accomplish any of the desired emotional conflict. Look, I'm not a therapist or a mental health expert, so I don't want to make any sweeping claims about trauma and grief, but I can say that this feels reductive, and from a storytelling perspective, the justification of Cruel's behavior as just having her mom be killed by dogs feels so boring and dry that it robs any real form of villainy from her very simplistic idea. Her name is Cruel Evil in a Disney story. Stories where bad characters are expressed through how they're drawn, how they're performed, and so on and so forth. But on a more serious note, I'm going to give a specific content warning here, as I will be mentioning a pretty explicit violent scene and panels, so I will leave a timestamp to skip ahead if you want. So, to ensure I'm presenting this in good faith, I'm picking a hero that I have affection for. Red Hood, Jason Todd. I'm using his time as Robin as a backstory because that's how modern interpretations treat his time as Robin. Set dressing for who he is now, which, like, upon his debut, he was also a circus kid until that was retconned and he became a street delinquent, and then after his death, he was forgotten for longer than the written history for when he was Robin. His death is a lot of things, but worst of all is the overindulgent violent acts committed upon him in the infamous Death in the Family storyline, where Joker rigged a bomb to explode his body, but not before beating him with a crowbar, and then fans voted for Batman to fail to save him, and then the betrayal of his mother, and the deeply racist depiction of the Middle East. There's a lot of shock value in the storyline, which is just a lazy storytelling technique. Shock value alone is like a tropey, cruel variation of friendship is magic. It's not complex, it's just an attempt to rely on audiences' predetermined perceptions to be considered satisfying. Therefore, this doesn't treat Jason's story with any care, and worse, the storyline rarely focuses on Jason and instead meditates on Batman's failure, how Bruce failed Jason, and all the subsequent grief that plays along with that.
Tell me, what bothers you more? That your greatest failure has returned from the grave? Or that I've become a better Batman than you?
Think of Arkham Knight as a great example and articulation of this.
Batman's not coming to save you, Jason.
Who come?
Who do you hate?
Batman.
This crucial part of Jason's backstory, though, is essentially not about him, and doesn't really give him any real agency in the storyline that he's allegedly famous for. Which is why so many modern adaptations change so much of that source material. Honestly, I think Alan Moore said it best when he was speaking about his writing of The Killing Joke. I think it put far too much melodramatic weight upon a character that was never designed to carry it. It was too nasty, it was too physically violent for a simplistic character like Batman. I'm aware he's speaking about a very different storyline, but due to the same year publication and Frank Miller voicing similar concerns to the Death in the Family, it's indicative more of the trend and ultimately the failings of this approach. Batman and Robin are vigilantes who fight crime in spandex. There's a capacity to the narrative weight they can carry, and stepping beyond that isn't going to achieve anything deeper, only shock value. And so ultimately, the fixation on tragic backstories, least of which, when they're not done with care or any of the previous steps we've talked about, can leave a work boring or dry because it's ultimately just a single tool, a tool that can be used to meditate on emotional conflict and character lore, but doesn't inherently prove a story's quality by just existing. It's why The Amazing Spider-Man and Man of Steel or any comic book movie with a desaturated color palette can feel so stale, because all of that sadness and stagnation builds to a very humorless and dull point. I remember one of my old English teachers telling me, whether you're writing an essay or telling a story, imagine me standing over you, and after you finish explaining something, I rudely interrupt you with a simple question. So what? Which was obviously an attempt to get us to try to understand the importance of commentary, but I think now I interpret that advice as trying to get us to go deeper and understand that there should be an underlying purpose to anything we really spend our attention towards. If the attention is given to a tragic backstory, then it shouldn't exist separately from the work, but in tandem with it. Because, as previously mentioned, a tragic backstory does accomplish an approach to vulnerability and dialogue in ways other methods can't. When obviously we know the heroes win in the end and the villains lose, the tragic backstory is also a way of providing a halt on triumph and giving emotional stakes to the conflict. This way the story doesn't always feel like it's win after win after win, but still has the essence of failure and disruption, because obviously fixations on even positive emotions can lead to equally boring stories. And I think that this re-examination of backstories and approach to storytelling is more a movement to try and veer away from the stagnating grim tones that a story can fall into, ushering people to truly ponder the purpose behind the storytelling choices made, and if the goal is just to create a sadder and badder story, then perhaps that accomplishes very little other than that. So what then? Go write your own tragic backstory with knowledge that it'll only be as good and strong as the rest of the work. That big, bad, tragic past will only be as good as the character's relationship to the rest of the cast, only as good as their aspirations, their moments of triumphs, and the large structure and framework that it's built with.
He came down to take this car and took Ben away from us.
From him, not you. That's not the point, and I'll prove it.
So thank you for joining me during this long, pondering moment. I think you're a pretty good listener. So let's go stop whatever big bad is out there and go get our MacGuffin back. And for now, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.